Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for our third monthly webinar update for the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL project. I'm Josh Griffin from Ohio EPA, serving as the Lake Erie Program Manager, and I'll be starting off the presentation today before Paul Gledhill steps in to talk about the technical content. Our project team includes other Ohio EPA staff and staff from the Ohio Department of Agriculture and Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Ohio Lake Erie Commission staff and Director Joy Mullenix have also been active in helping us coordinate with our sister agencies. Tetra Tech is here with us today to help coordinate the webinar logistics and facilitate the questions and answers component at the end of the presentation. Today, we also have Matt Lane joining us from the Ohio Department of Agriculture. Kirk Hines will continue to be the primary point of contact for the Ohio Department of Agriculture, but he's attending the annual meeting for the Ohio Federation of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. For those who were with us last time, the format of today's webinar should feel familiar. As a reminder, and for anyone new who's joining us, we'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions at any time. Questions asked in the Q&A box won't appear to the public, but staff will see all questions sent in by participants. Please note that audience members' microphones are muted and the raise hand function is also disabled. Participants should use the submit questions function to receive technical assistance, ask questions, or submit comments. On your task pane, you can see an icon with a bubble with a question mark in it. That is where you will access the submit questions function. There are also two handouts attached today that you can access by clicking on the page icon on the task pane. Not all questions will be answered, but we are keeping records of them all. Some unanswered questions may be incorporated into the frequently asked questions document on the web page. We anticipate updating the frequently asked questions soon with questions about nutrient sources received when the modules were presented and during monthly webinars. We expect that update to be completed around the time of the next outreach event at the end of the month. Other questions might not be addressed today because they involve future management decisions in the TMDL process. Now for a brief overview of what we will cover today. First, we'll discuss general project updates and then the updated project schedule. The bulk of the presentation today will be an exploration of the universe of sources in the watershed. Then we'll get to the questions. We continue to improve our new website and wanted to include some additional information. The website went live on December 3rd, and a lot of kinks are getting worked out. All the old information is there, we just have a new navigation and new links to pages and documents. Internal and external search functions should continue to improve. Today, we wanted to share a few tips for using the new website that might help improve your experience. If you have any old links saved, they will no longer work, but will direct you to the main agency webpage. The agency continues to make improvements as we adapt to the new platform, so the website is still changing. One problem that we have identified is that the page load times are slow for users using a proxy network, like a VPN connection. Please be patient as the pages load. It may take a moment for all web pages content to appear. If you find yourself frequenting certain pages, I highly recommend bookmarking those pages. This can help minimize the number of times you wait for a web page to load. The links in the TMDL program page and Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL tab are included here. We do ask that you please report problems with the website. We can fix broken links on the new web page and take suggestions on how the website displays. At the bottom of our web page is a ribbon that includes a link to the Customer Support Center. We ask that you use this function to report issues and make suggestions. On February 22nd, we sent notification to our listserv to let stakeholders know that we had extended the timeline for the draft preliminary modeling results. The new timeline moves the proposed date for the preliminary modeling results to June 30th. Benefits of the new schedule include additional time for stakeholder engagement as the agency develops the preliminary modeling report. This is an important step of the TMDL process, and outreach can now provide more robust engagement. Here's a revised version of the project schedule, which is attached as a handout to today's presentation and will also be updated on the website. Of note, the in-person outreach for March 29th is still going to take place. The registration information should come out next week for these scheduled events. We'll be at 2 locations on March 29th. Ohio Northern University in Ada from 1 to 3 p.m., then Bowling Green State University from 6 to 8 p.m. The evening session will also have a virtual option to participate. At BGSU, we've reserved the large ballroom across the hall from the auditorium where listening sessions were held in November to provide more efficient social distancing. There will be additional COVID-19 protocols in place for the events, and they may vary by location. Please see registration information for details. The presentations for both locations will be the same, so it is not necessary to attend both events. Now, Paul Gledhill will take over to talk about the source assessment.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to outline the phosphorus source assessment that will be included in the TMDL's preliminary modeling results report. I'm going to call it the PMR throughout this presentation. Having a robust source assessment is important to best understand the phosphorus reduction allocations that the TMDL will outline. This will also help us identify the best implementation actions that can occur to make those reductions happen. The Western Lake Erie watershed, and particularly the Maumee watershed, is the setting for a great deal of active research. There is a very rich body of published studies that this source assessment is primarily based on. Now, in the handout section of today's GoToWebinar, one of the 2 handouts is the ongoing works cited references for the PMR. There's over 110 studies and reports currently cited. You'll see an asterisk next to the studies on the reference list that have taken place within this watershed. Understanding phosphorus export trends in the Maumee watershed is a great place to start understanding the sources. These figures here are from a study that was published last year. The top 2 figures show the concentrations of total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus. The bottom 2 figures show the loads for total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus. The orange circles on the top figures, they show each year's concentration, and the purple circles show the flow-weighted mean concentrations. On the bottom 2 figures, the blue circles show the year's load. The important takeaway from this work are the light-colored circles on all 4 of the figures. These are the flow normalized concentrations on the top and loads on the bottom. Flow normalization is an analysis method that helps make patterns more evident. So we can see here a large decline in the total phosphorus loads that occurred in the late 80s through the early 90s. And this was considered an environmental success. It addressed excessive algae and hypoxia or dead zones in Lake Erie. Not long after that decline of total phosphorus, however, you can see that there was a rise in the dissolved reactive phosphorus, the DRP. And this happened in the late 90s through the 2000s. Now, it is notable on both the concentration up here and the load figures. This rise in DRP has been directly connected to the start of the Western Lake Erie's annual HABs. A primary goal of this source assessment is to try to get a handle on what brought about this rise in DRP. Now, understanding this should help guide implementation that's most likely to address DRP and thus the HABs. On this figure, we're looking at the spring loading season, or March through July's, Maumee's total phosphorus load. This does include the area downstream of Waterville, so it's the entire Maumee watershed. And this was published in Ohio EPA's 2020 Nutrient Mass Balance Report. On each bar from 2013 through 2019, you see the majority of the bar is made up of this dark red color. This represents the non-point source, and it delivers the vast majority of the total phosphorus load. On average, non-point source is responsible for 92% of the load. Point sources from treatment plants and combined sewage overflows contribute an average of about 6% of the load, And then finally, household treatment systems are calculated in the very middle there as 2% of the load. The green bar shows the 2008 load. That's the baseline year for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement's Annex 4 phosphorus reduction targets. The last thing to note here is the red line that cuts through all of these bars. This is the TMDL's total phosphorus target load. So the PMR source assessment deals with all of these sources, but clearly non-point source delivers the majority of the load, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So within the PMR's source assessment, and briefly today on this webinar, we're going to discuss all of these categories of non-point source load. We've reviewed work by and have been in direct communication with researchers and resource experts to put this information together. You'll notice that changes in watershed hydrology is also discussed along with non-point source loads. And this is because hydrology is a very important factor of non-point source loads. These figures here were developed by Dr. Laura Johnson, the director of Heidelberg's National Center for Water Quality Research, and they were published by Gao et al. Last year. Now, there's quite a bit going on in these figures, but I want to focus on one important takeaway. Now, the figure on the left shows dissolved reactive phosphorus load plotted against stream flow discharge. You can think of that as the total amount of water that the Maumee delivered to Lake Erie. On the right, we're looking at the particulate phosphorus load, again plotted against stream flow discharge. Now, particulate phosphorus is basically what's left over when we take DRP out of the total phosphorus. It's the phosphorus that's bound to solids, mostly sediments. Now, the dots on these two figures, no matter which color, are each showing one spring loading season's load. And the main takeaway to note on these figures is how linear these relationships are. The dots generally stay very close to the solid black diagonal lines. And this shows that the phosphorus loads in the Maumee are very tightly tied to hydrology. The more water we have, the more load is exported. Now, there are other lessons that can be drawn from this work that the paper that this is from discusses, and we will get into in the PMR. We're not going to get into those details today, but they certainly help us understand the nature of phosphorus sources, and they offer some insight on how fast we might see nutrient reduction given enough focused implementation actions in the future. So on to the actual sources. We'll first start with considering agricultural fertilizers. They're both commercial, or sometimes called inorganic, and manure types of fertilizer used in the Maumee. In order to understand these as a source of phosphorus exported to Lake Erie, we first have to understand their use. Commercial fertilizer often also contains nitrogen and potassium. MAP and DAP are most commonly used. Answering questions about fertilizer use requires some inferencing because of privacy issues. Retailer sales has been used to calculate the amount of commercial fertilizer utilized. The Fertilizer Institute also publishes data via a program they call NewGIS. And finally, The Ohio State University has developed a public-private partnership where they study fertilizer usage on farms in a very detailed manner, but it ensures privacy. Commercial fertilizer is applied to soils that are found to be in deficit of a certain nutrient. They are most often applied in the spring prior to planting a crop, but occasionally after fall harvest. There is evidence that commercial fertilizer use has declined in the Maumee, and we plan to document this in the PMR. A partial explanation for this is that with increasing use of farm-scale nutrient management planning, we're seeing less of the commercial fertilizer going on. This picture dramatizes precision fertilizer application, which is a part of the 4R Best Management Practice Suite. And there's also evidence that the use of manure has replaced some of commercial fertilizer. So let's talk about manure next. Livestock waste or manure is also utilized as fertilizer. Now, the amount of manure produced is generally estimated based on livestock populations and then an understanding of the manure's nutrient content. The Ohio Department of Agriculture has been looking very closely at all of these sources of information. The where of manure application is really important because it is costly to ship manure large distances. So the location of livestock feeding operations is really important to understanding where manure is applied. I'll note there's an exception here regarding chicken litter. This product has largely been sold as a commodity, so it's very often transported much longer distances than cow or pig manure. Now, feeding operations manure storage capacity plays a role in the timing of manure application. It often occurs further into the summer compared to commercial fertilizer, most often following wheat or corn silage harvest, or then later into the fall after corn or soybean harvests happen. This trend, produced by the Ohio Department of Agriculture, it shows the cattle and hog counts in the Maumee watershed going back to the 1950s. You'll see a general decline in the 1980s that bottomed out around the mid-2000s. From that point, there's been an increase in livestock. This newer influx of livestock, they're more densely contained in concentrated feeding operations. Now, many of these operations are permitted under Ohio Department of Agriculture's CAF program. Operations in this program are required to follow various manure management protocols, and all of this will be outlined in our PMR report. Finally, note on this figure that the animal units were still on the decline in the 1990s, and that's when we saw that the DRP export trend that I mentioned earlier was actually increasing. Here's another figure from the Department of Agriculture that shows kind of the more recent time period of livestock production growth in the Maumee watershed. So putting all this information together, we realized that commercial and manure uses of fertilizer are not static. ODA, Ohio Department of Agriculture, has calculated that manure currently accounts for around 20% of the crop's phosphorus needs in the watershed. They are continuing this work to analyze the overall reservoir of soil P in cropland. Now, that around 20% of manure meeting crop needs in the Maumee that ODA calculated, that has been confirmed by an effort that the Environmental Working Group is currently carrying out. Staff from Ohio EPA, ODA, the Ohio Lake Erie Commission, and NRCS have been regularly meeting with the Environmental Working Group about their effort. It's not looking like that work is going to be published until later this year, but we're making an effort to include as much of their conclusions as possible in the TMDL's PMR as well. The PMR will cite various publications that have found increases in manure production is being offset by declines in the use of commercial fertilizer in the Maumee, and we expect more information on this front as studies continue. Now, as far as quantifying fertilizer as a phosphorus source to Western Lake Erie via the Maumee watershed, SWOT modeling by OSU has happened. They've calculated that commercial fertilizer is responsible for about 58% of the DRP and 42% of the total phosphorus that is observed being delivered by the Maumee to Lake Erie. This work also found that manure is responsible for 12% of the DRP and 8% of the total phosphorus. The modeling work also looked at delivery ratios, and they found basically the same delivery ratios for commercial fertilizer and for manure that's applied to fields. About 1% of the DRP applied to fields, and about 3% of the total phosphorus that applied to fields makes it to Lake Erie based on this modeling study. Okay, next we'll talk about phosphorus that's delivered from soil. In general, phosphorus binds to soil relatively well. That's especially when compared to nitrogen, for instance. So a great deal of phosphorus is delivered to streams when erosion delivers sediment to streams. Soil conservation efforts in the late 20th century have done a really good job at cutting down erosion, however. USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service has calculated that by 2012, over 60% of the total phosphorus export to Western Lake Erie was reduced from the decades of soil conservation. This success contributed to that big dip in the Maumee River's total phosphorus loads throughout the 80s and the 90s on that trends we were looking at earlier. And it has also really helped the ecological health of streams. And that's what Ohio EPA's surface water group we refer to as the near field. Now, while soils are staying put more, there is a concern about phosphorus accumulating in soils to excessive amounts. and this is often described as legacy phosphorus. Legacy phosphorus has been found to move downslope. It often takes its time going from the fields to the edge of the fields, to the stream sides, into the stream channels, along the stream banks, and then eventually exported through the Maumee into Lake Erie. There is evidence that as conservation tillage and hydrology has changed, the movement of phosphorus, and particularly in the dissolved form, has increased. This figure is from a USDA report on the movement of phosphorus. It shows a threshold effect. When soil gets enriched to a certain degree, relatively more dissolved phosphorus is exported as runoff. Now, this also occurs via in the subsurface via tile drainage flow as well. So this is just shown here to illustrate that there's a great deal of factors impacting the movement of legacy P. And this is all under detailed study happening right now in the Maumee watershed. From that OSU SWOT modeling we mentioned a few slides ago, the amount of phosphorus delivered by soil sources, which includes legacy phosphorus, has been calculated to be 20% of the dissolved reactive phosphorus and about 45% of the total phosphorus. As noted on the last slide, there's many complexities in understanding this movement, which does impact the uncertainty of these calculations. Now, overall, soil conservation has been a game changer in reducing environmental issues. However, increased DRP export seems to be an unintended consequence of these actions. Now, certainly this has been exacerbated by increasing hydrology, which brings more water, and increasing tiling, which moves water off of fields more efficiently. The figure on the bottom of this slide, it shows the increases in residue management, which is an aspect of soil conservation. Now, this increase coincides with the increase of the DRP trend that we were looking at the start of this discussion. Farm nutrient management planning, it considers many factors that contribute to legacy P. For instance, more detailed soil testing often results in less fertilization, which facilitates drawing soil P down. So that's a great thing. Taken as a whole, however, legacy P does have a chance to introduce a lag in the response of phosphorus export reduction, even when we have more rigorous cuts being made to phosphorus inputs to the watershed. So we plan to discuss all of the state of this science in the PMR. Moving on, ditch and streamside sources of phosphorus will also be considered. Certainly, soil lost due to bank and channel erosion contributes to phosphorus. And as noted on the last few slides, legacy phosphorus is known to move downslope and has been found to accumulate on stream sides and even in channels. Now, streams can also provide a service, as in they can trap, maybe even just temporarily, the export of P. Active research in the Maumee is working to identify the magnitude of stream bank sources of phosphorus. And this figure is from preliminary work being carried out by the USGS, and this shows an ordination of components that essentially fingerprint the sources of sediment flowing in streams. And this work hasn't been published final yet, but the early indications suggest that stream banks can be a significant sediment source. Now, practices that focus on stream bank stability, reducing erosive forces, and slowing water inputs have shown promise. So while studies telling us the magnitude of phosphorus contributions from stream sides and stream banks, they're not complete yet, but we do know that these sources must be considered. And in a way, while these could be thought of as sources, stream sides and stream channels also present an opportunity to capture or even just slow down nutrient export. Natural lands are often considered to contribute phosphorus loads at a background concentration. So basically, it's our overall goal to reduce phosphorus export from lands with more active human uses, such as urban development and agriculture, to get them down to these natural background conditions. And regarding atmospheric deposition, phosphorus doesn't have a stable state within the atmosphere like nitrogen does. Therefore, there's a relatively minimal amount of atmospheric deposition of phosphorus. Atmospheric deposition is not normally accounted for as a separate phosphorus source when over the land, when dealing with watersheds. However, I'll note that atmospheric deposition does get itemized when doing accounting of phosphorus over large bodies of water. So for instance, the published budget for all of the phosphorus that enters Lake Erie, that's determined that 6% of that total load is from atmospheric deposition over the actual lake, over the water. But since this TMDL is focused on the Maumee watershed, we will not be separating out atmospheric deposition. So as noted earlier, hydrology is really the driver of non-point sources. The figure on this slide is from a paper that USDA's Agriculture Research Service published in 2020, and it looks specifically at hydrology changes in the Maumee watershed. This work found that rainfall has increased about 12% and stream flow between 19 and 32% between 1975 and 2017. The authors noted that the increase is greater in the southern portion of the watershed, so down here on the St. Mary's and the Auglaize watershed, versus the northern parts of the watershed and the extreme east. The increase of rainfall has come mostly about with heavy and very heavy rainfall events, and the authors of this paper actually get into the implications this has, which is more dissolved. This certainly has contributed to the dissolved phosphorus increases that we've seen. The PMR for this project will also provide details on various point sources of phosphorus to the Maumee. TMDLs require that permitted point sources be allocated differently than non-point sources. In the TMDL speak, they're part of the waste load allocation. Wastewater treatment plants and most stormwater are included in this category. Ohio EPA also regulates beneficial reuse of wastewater and other treatment byproducts, for example, biosolids. We'll cover these three items on the next couple slides. The pie chart in the middle of this slide breaks down that 6% of the total phosphorus load that permitted treatment facilities contribute to the Maumee during the spring season. 72% of this load is from point source treatment facilities that originate in Ohio. The majority of that load, this blue section, is from our major municipal wastewater treatment facilities. Now, these facilities have had phosphorus limits since the 1980s. Today, many of them have optimized treatment to maintain a higher level of control than is required to meet the compliance with their permit limits. The remaining load is from smaller municipal facilities, industrial facilities, and combined sewer overflows. Ohio EPA is able to track these facilities with a high degree of certainty because they monitor their effluent quality and quantity, and they report this information to us monthly. Stormwater is permitted from most urbanized areas, from many industrial facilities, and at construction sites that disturb greater than 1 acre. Research on stormwater from developed areas indicates predominant mechanisms driving phosphorus loading include enhanced transport from impervious surfaces. The sources of phosphorus in stormwater include pet waste, grass and yard waste, and erosion from unvegetated or undervegetated areas. Now, like non-point sources, these sources are more difficult to directly monitor. Beneficial use of biosolids is an activity that is regulated by the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act does not allow for discharge of biosolids to surface waters. It permits the beneficial use of treated biosolids, but biosolids will receive no waste load allocation in the TMDL. The goals of this program are first to protect public health and the environment. Encouraging beneficial use of biosolids fulfills a need for agronomic nutrients while reducing what goes to landfills. So beneficial use of biosolids requires supporting documentation, and Ohio EPA maintains that information, and that's what we're seeing here on this map. Ohio EPA also oversees the state programs for beneficial reuse of treated wastewater and for irrigation, and utilizing liquid wastes for an agronomic benefit. Now, these programs were developed to promote sustainability through wastewater reuse and management. Wastewater reuse is not as common as the traditional facilities, which just discharge to surface waters. There are currently fewer than 10 facilities in the Maumee watershed permitted to land apply wastewater. Generally, these facilities are applying sludge from biological wastewater treatment or nutrient-rich wastewater from food processing plants. There are two major design types of household sewage treatment systems, and these are accounted for differently in TMDLs. Discharging systems, like we see on the left, require advanced treatment prior to discharging to surface water. Starting in 2005, new and replacement discharging systems have been required to obtain NPDES permit coverage from Ohio EPA under a general permit. These systems will be accounted for as part of the waste load allocation in the TMDL. At the household scale, removing phosphorus from a discharging treatment system is challenging. Managing phosphorus is accomplished by prioritizing on-site dispersal and promoting connections to municipal wastewater treatment facilities. The Ohio Department of Health oversees on-site systems where effluent is dispersed to soils on the lot. These systems are not considered point sources and will be accounted for the load allocation, the non-point source allocation within the TMDL. Most phosphorus exports from on-site systems originate where system failures result in surfacing of effluent or people have short-circuited the systems connecting them to surface water. The PMR's source assessment will also discuss the impact from in-stream processing of phosphorus. Streams can release and store phosphorus, which makes them a source or a sink depending on conditions. Now, there are many factors that come into play with these processes, and it makes it a very challenging and evolving field of study. The figure on this slide is from some very current research by OSU that proposes a new model for how to view rivers as reactors for bioavailable phosphorus. This work found that suspended sediment in streams is absorbing dissolved reactive phosphorus in flowing water during storm events. The study suggests that sediment is providing a service, basically, to the watershed by reducing the bioavailability of phosphorus. Now, as described earlier in this presentation, sediment export has reduced over the last decades in the Maumee, resulting in really great environmental improvements. However, again, an unintended consequence of reduced sediment may have reduced this environmental service that we've described here on this slide. The final aspect that the PMR source assessment will include will combine all of the sources and factors that I've given a very brief outline of here, and we'll examine the variation around the Maumee watershed, basically looking at what are referred to as critical source areas. Now, there's various methods that have been used to summarize these areas, and we'll provide an overview of all of these methods. We will also be carrying out some new analysis on the water quality monitoring data from various streamflow gauges throughout the Maumee watershed, and that'll be included in this chapter as well. So that concludes our overview of the TMDL's phosphorus source assessment. We appreciate everybody attending today, and want to remind folks that you can put your questions in the Q&A pane of the webinar program. And now we are ready to shift over to the question and answer portions.
All right, thanks, Paul. This is Barry Tonic from Tetra Tech. I'm going to facilitate this section of the webinar. We do have a couple questions coming in now. I think this first one is for Josh, and this refers to a slide you showed early in the presentation, Paul. Does the prior slide concern total phosphorus or dissolved reactive phosphorus? I think Josh was going to answer that question.
Yeah, Paul, could you please go back up to slide 14 so everybody can see it? Sorry, slide 17 was the one I was looking at. There we go. So this slide actually, so the panel on the left was looking at dissolved reactive phosphorus and its relationship to the discharge from the Maumee River. And the panel on the right is looking at phosphorus a little bit differently than the TP, DRP that we're typically looking at in the TMDL. And they've separated it out as the particulate phosphorus, which is essentially the total phosphorus less the dissolved reactive portion, in that the trends of those are slightly different. So it's the DRP and a little bit of a new term that some researchers use in particulate phosphorus.
All right, thanks for that. We've got another question that's come in also for you, Josh. How are you accounting for the nutrients released via crop residue breakdown?
So I'm not going to have a specific answer to that question today, but that's exactly the type of feedback we were hoping to hear. We shared the kind of categories of phosphorus sources that we were looking at in the presentation. That's one that was not is not specifically called out in the structure of this presentation today, but certainly something to consider as you evaluate phosphorus. So appreciate sharing that suggestion. And we also, the attachment with our sources on the presentation, we'd ask anybody who looks through that and notes any studies that we aren't looking at, in this case, maybe some studies about where crop residue might play a role in managing phosphorus moving forward, that we'd appreciate anybody willing to share any of those with us. So largely it's part of the non-point source, part of the load allocation in the TMDL, but I don't have a specific answer today.
And I totally agree with this. Is Paul. With what Josh says. The Agriculture Research Service branch of USDA, a lot of their studies are looking at this. They're doing a lot of the edge of field studies in the Maumee, and they're considering this whole idea of recent versus legacy phosphorus. So they have a lot of papers, and they've got tons of research happening right now. So it's a really active study, active field right now.
All right, thanks. Josh, again, a couple questions about the slides. Are the PowerPoint slides going to be available online or otherwise circulated after the webinar?
Yeah, we'll post a recording of the webinar on our project webpage, that Maumee Watershed tab that we shared a link to. And when we do that, we will go ahead and shoot an email out to our listservs to let folks know that it's posted. It's been taking us about a week to get it posted, so hopefully early next week it'll be on the webpage.
Okay, thanks. Another question here. Are the permitting divisions of Ag and Ohio EPA on board with your findings? And will the permitting agency's personnel be part of future in-person meetings? I think that question was for you, Josh.
So we're actively working with the permitting folks at Ohio EPA, and also we have folks from OD, the Ohio Department of Agriculture, who participate. Kirk Hines, who's typically here, oversees a lot of the permitting that happens at ODA. So there's certainly communication between the groups, and as we explore sources and evaluate implementation, I think that communication will continue. So how we go about addressing those issues moving forward.
Okay, thanks. We're waiting for additional questions to come in. I think I see one here. Yes. Please go back to slide 41 and give us more details on how you intend to identify the concentrated phosphorus areas. And Paul, I believe this one was for you. Slide 41. And again, the question was how you intend to identify the concentrated phosphorus areas.
Critical source areas, there's been a number of different ways that in the literature it's been summarized. We will provide an overview of that. This citation, if you look at our works cited list from Gray Evanson, this is from part of the OSU's modeling effort. And this was actually ensemble modeling, where they had several different models kind of layered on top of each other. These are actually HUC 12s, so kind of watershed management units. And what they did was they identified how many models agree that there is higher amount of export of phosphorus DRP export from that. And so the watersheds with more models that agree it's hot, it's more of a source, and they flag those. And that's just one method for identifying critical source areas. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the water quality gauges. We've presented in the past slides, and you can see it in Ohio's Domestic Action Plan. We have a really dense network of stream flow gauges where there's continuous water quality being monitored. And I think that it's a great source of data because we can kind of see the differences in all these different, throughout the watershed, different sizes of streams, small tributaries to kind of the larger Blanchard, Maumee, Ottawa. So we're working with Laura Johnson. We had a meeting with her this week to get as much as we can out of those sites as well, to understand the differences and understand where areas are more critical. As I mentioned when we were talking about the changes in hydrology, we've certainly seen the southern part of the watershed, especially the St. Mary's and the Auglaize, it just definitely gets more water, more water from rain and more stream flow. And as we documented in Domestic Action Plan that the Ohio Lake Area Commission has published, there's just kind of more denser land use happening there. Josh, I'll let Josh or Matt Lane want to answer any more to that. Otherwise, I'll stop.
Anything to add to that, Josh or Matt?
I don't have anything to add. I think Paul talked about a lot. It's definitely one of the questions that are frequently posed, so it's been sliced a lot of different ways. Okay.
All right, thanks. We've also had a couple of other questions or comments rather come in about wanting to see the slides separately and making them available. I think that question was answered, that they would be posted. We had a couple of comments on that. The recording is appreciated, but the presentation slides themselves are useful. And then we have a follow-up on the question about the personnel from Ag and Ohio EPA, the permitting personnel. Will they be a part of the future in-person meetings? There was a comment that this may not have been completely answered in the earlier question. I think this was for you, Josh. Will the permitting people be at the in-person meetings in the future?
So I don't know specifically if the permitting people will be at future in-person meetings. It would depend on the content of the meeting and the agenda of the day. There may be opportunities for them to participate as we get into in-person meetings, especially when they deal more with implementation and how we would go about permitting the sources moving forward. We do have experience within our Ohio EPA people who are going to be present in the permitting realm, and we work closely together. So we may not ask them to come along for those specific questions if we think we can handle them with our TMDL project team.
But it might help to note that Tiffany Cavlack will be at the in-person meeting, and she's the chief. She's in charge of all of Ohio EPA's surface water permitting. And then Kirk Hines from ODA, I believe, will be there, and he oversees the permitting at agriculture.
All right,
that is
thanks.
correct. That is correct. I will be at the March 29th in-person meetings.
All right, Tiffany, now that I've got you on here, the question is asked again about the slides. Will they be posted or will they just be available on the webinar, on the recording of the webinar?
We will have both.
Okay,
we will have both. We will have the recorded webinar, and we will also post these slides probably within the next 24 hours. We just have to get them up on the website. So that these slides should be available by tomorrow for those that are asking, and then the live webinar link should be available within the week.
All right, very good. And then a request to share the link to the Maumee River Watershed TMDL website. I see that's being posted. I think, is that in the chat there, Melinda? Yeah, I think it has gone out. So if you look in your chat box, you should be able to see that URL for the Maumee River Watershed TMDL website. Thank you for that. We are getting a few more questions coming in. As Josh mentioned early on, we're not prepared to answer every question today, but we do appreciate the questions. Thanks for those. We'll be discussing those after the webinar and have more information later. Josh mentioned that some of these may be included in the update of the frequently asked questions document. Let's see, I'm just scrolling through this questions list now. Here's a question for Paul, I believe. Could you please give us more details on who is on the environmental working group and what is their function?
I can partially address that. I'm not actually familiar with the official name of the project. Sarah Porter is the lead on that work. And like I mentioned, folks from ODA, Ohio EPA, Ohio Lake Area Commission, and NRCS are on kind of an advisory panel with that effort. It's not clear when it will be completed, as I mentioned, but the state's trying to make sure that the decisions they're making for that project, just make sense for what we're seeing in the various regulation programs.
This is Josh. I'd jump in and add a little bit to that. So the environmental working group is a third-party nonprofit, I believe, entity who's currently funded through the Herb Foundation to do a project on sources of manure in the Maumee River watershed. So we've seen similar products from a similar project in Michigan, and that's kind of ongoing in Ohio as well. So we haven't seen the final results from that, but they do have a working group or an advisory group of state agency and federal resource folks with NRCS that are kind of helping them kind of explore the information available and look at some of the manure management questions.
All right, thanks, Josh. A question on cover crops here for Matt, I believe. Are there any studies on the use of cover crops to reduce phosphorus?
Yes. Hello, this is Matt Lane with the Ohio Department of Agriculture. There are studies that have taken place that examine, nutrient reduction or possible nutrient reduction with the use of cover crops. I don't have a list of them in my head, but I can tell you my experiences with them is not all of them show necessarily a reduction in phosphorus loss with the use of cover crops. It can be somewhat of a mixed bag where we may see with the use of cover crops a reduction in erosion and a reduction in particulate phosphorus, but possibly an increase in soluble reactive phosphorus. But I think work continues.
Okay. And a follow-up question on the environmental working group for Josh. Is the work of the environmental working group open for review?
With them being, a third party, we've participated in the study so far as they've asked us to help find information and stuff, but we can't answer questions for what their intentions are for sharing the information for review. Once it's published, it will be then publicly available for review, but whatever they choose to do in the meantime is not something that we're able to answer.
Okay. Another question here. Will the text of the references be open to those so interested in looking at the details? Paul, that one's for you.
Right. So like I mentioned during the talk, if you go to the handouts portion of this GoToWebinar, you can find the work cited, and I would recommend Googling a citation of a study you're interested in. The vast majority of these are publicly available. If they're not publicly available, I don't think that we would be able to share them because of copyright issues, but any public library or university library should be able to find a handful of things that aren't publicly available. But it's pretty amazing how many things now are available free on the internet.
All right, Paul, and now that we've got you unmuted, another one for you. Could you please explain slide number 28 in a little more detail?
Let me find it. Let's see what slide 28 is.
28, there we go.
Yeah, so this was kind of the summary of the sediment sources. So the top half of the slide is from the OSU modeling effort, CAST et al. That was published last year. In that paper, OSU has done a lot of mainly SWAT modeling on the Maumee watershed and some really great studies. I think a lot that we'll look into when in the TMDL when we consider implementation actions. But this particular paper was really focused on the actual sources of phosphorus, which is why it's so helpful in coming up with this source assessment. So they group sediment and legacy kind of all together as what they call sediment as soil sources. And the 20% is by that they mean 20% of the load that the Maumee delivers to technically it's at Waterville, what they monitor at Waterville. They attribute that as from these soil sources, and then 45% of the total phosphorus load. And I just added this uncertainty note here because, as we mentioned, when looking at legacy P, there's a lot still being learned about legacy phosphorus, and so it's probably this is a little bit less certain than the fertilizer sources that I presented a few slides prior to this. And then the bottom slide is from a Jarvie paper. Helen Jarvie has some excellent papers talking about this, the concept of we've done a great job at reducing sediment and we've slowed down particulate phosphorus, the non-reactive portion of phosphorus, but we've seen this rise in dissolved reactive phosphorus. And this paper talks about the connections to changes in hydrology and changes to agricultural management practices and how and this plot is directly from that paper. And they show how this residue management, so basically more efforts to keeping soils on the field, has coincided to a degree with increases of DRP. Josh or Matt, feel free to add or clarify or anything to that.
Anything to add to that, Josh or Matt?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. A question for Tiffany here. What type of cooperation is there with Indiana and Michigan on the development of the TMDL and the PMR, the preliminary modeling results?
So I'll defer to Josh and or Paul about what we may be building into the PMR document related to Indiana and Michigan. But I do want to make clear that this is an Ohio-specific TMDL. We do not have control over the resources being performed in Indiana and Michigan. This isn't a multi-state TMDL. It's an Ohio-specific TMDL, but we do cooperate with them. We meet with their TMDL folks regularly and coordinate with US EPA, GLENPO on all of our domestic action plans, which both Indiana and Michigan are implementing their portions through their existing domestic action plans.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. I'm scrolling through the list here. I'm not seeing any new questions come in. Scroll back up. And again, thank you for these. These are very helpful, I know, to the TMDL and the other staffs at Ohio. No, I'm not seeing any new questions come in. So if you have any final questions, please do go ahead and type those in. We'll try to get to those before we break off. Otherwise, as we mentioned, we have some information here that we can add to the frequently asked questions document, as well as to the overall discussion on development of the TMDL.
I was going to say, I think we can wrap up a little bit early if we're not seeing any additional questions coming in. The questions we got are very much appreciated. Learn a lot each time we get the opportunity to do this. And again, would encourage anyone who's interested in digging into the literature to understand the sources better, we've shared the long list of sources we've already cited as we've started to develop this into more of a report. And we would appreciate any additional sources anybody's willing to share. With that, appreciate everybody's time, and I think we can wrap up here.